It's time for us to check back in with the People and Their Quilts to see some more of those beautiful examples. Is what we're going to do at the beginning of today's readings, and see what else the author has to talk about. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. The Triple Irish Chain. The Slonaker family, from whom this quilt came, lived in the community of Telford, a few miles from Jonesboro, Tennessee's oldest town. The Triple Irish Chain quilt is pieced and dated May 31st, 1887. Very few quilts in the southern Appalachian Mountains were dated and signed other than the friendship quilts. Less than 1% of the quilts had either initials or dates. Of course, the better-made quilts were more apt to have such identifying marks. Photographed at the Museum of Appalachia with the late evening sun shining through a knothole in the overhang barn. Grandmother's engagement ring. This pieced and appliqued quilt is so tastefully decorated, intricately quilted, and has little or no padding because it was intended for non-utilitarian use. It was made for its beauty, its art. The drapery border, the hearts and tassels, the appliqued heart clusters, and the quilted hearts throughout the design indicate that it probably was made as a wedding quilt. Called it Grandmother's Engagement Ring, it was made in Blount County, Tennessee in the 1860s to 70s. Kudzu in the Cumberland Gap. The Cumberland Gap was probably the nation's best known and most important natural passageway through which early hunters and settlers passed in their westward movement. Located where the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia meet, it was popularized by Daniel Boone, who is given credit for leading settlers into the New West, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and beyond. The Cumberland Gap pattern is listed in Tennessee Quilting by Elwood, Tenery, and Richardson, and was featured in the syndicated Nancy Cabot quilt pattern series printed in several newspapers in the 1930s and 1940s. This crib-size quilt was made recently by Joyce Tenery, shown in the accompanying photograph for her first grandchild yet unborn. Although the pattern is from the original Cumberland Gap design, Joyce added the word kudzu in the quilt name. Joyce chose the kudzu vine because of its prevalence around her home in Oak Ridge, Tennessee today. Active in local and state quilting organizations, she has taught her two teenage daughters to quilt. Iris Bouquet, a first-place winner. When Louise Kate of Knoxville married George Fowler, she gave up her teaching job to be with her husband, who worked for the Federal Food and Drug Administration. She did manage 14 years of further teaching in New York, Michigan, Virginia, and Wisconsin. After George retired and their children had left home, George and Louise came back to his ancestral home in Dutch Valley, Anderson County, Tennessee. This is a most beautiful valley, and the old Fowler place is one of the loveliest and most historic in the valley. It was only then that Louise started quilting. Louise saw a picture of an iris bouquet pattern and made substantial changes in adapting it to suit her fancy. Flowers were left out of the corners, a border was placed around the central floral design, and other alterations were made. The new design won first place in the Mixed Techniques category at the Museum of Appalachia Quilt Show and Sale in the spring of 1983. Like all quilters, Louise has enthusiasm for her work and looks forward to future projects. I'm planning on making a quilt for each of my children and including something symbolic from each of the 8 states where we lived while they were growing up. It may take a while, but I'll sure have something to look forward to. Something to keep me busy. Basket of flowers. When Uretha Thompson was a girl in Campbell County, Tennessee, she often watched her mother quilt, but was not encouraged to join her because her mother did not want her fine quilts to be used for training purposes. When Uretha married Bruce Irwin in 1928 and moved into his family's old home place at the foot of Lone Mountain near Andersonville, her mother-in-law, Nora, had a quilt set up before the fireplace in the large living room. I told Grandma Irwin that I'd like to learn to quilt, and she said, "Well, grab you a needle and go to work." I started working on it, and we finished that quilt, and she took it to the fair in Clinton and won first place on it. And ever since, I've been quilting off and on. I raised a family and worked for 25 years at the Atomic Energy Commission in Oak Ridge and at the Baptist Hospital in Knoxville, but I've quilted every chance I've had over 52 years. I wish I had one up now. The quilt shown here was started by Uretha in 1936 and finished about 2 years later. She borrowed the pattern, Baskets of Flowers, from her sister-in-law, Bonnie Irwin Carden. Uretha entered it in the Museum of Appalachia Quilt Show in March 1983 and won the Pride of Workmanship Special Award. Willie King Gault's quilts. Miss Willie Gault is one of the many enjoyable folk from whom I purchased many early relics in the years when I first started collecting for the Museum of Appalachia. Extremely sharp, witty, and loving, she was nevertheless as shrewd a businesswoman as any mountain horse trader. In her younger days, she had been a collector of, and sometimes dealer in, fine early relics from Greene County, Tennessee. This is a rich farming area with a strong German influence, and an area which contained perhaps more quality antiques than any other section of the state. I'd never seen any of Willie's quilts, but I felt sure that she had some, and I knew they would be of high quality. I called her son, King Gault, who lives next door, and they readily invited us to stop for a look at their quilts. Mrs. Gault had moved from the old farm home place in the community of Bulls Gap to her present home in the shadow of Tulscombe College, one of Tennessee's oldest institutions. Willie had some of her most cherished quilts out when we arrived. At 92, her dry wit and humor was effusive as ever. Willie King Gault of Greenville, Tennessee, and 3 of her fine applique quilts. The one shown on the left was made by her grandmother, Annie Willoughby Myers, from nearby Bulls Gap. The center quilt is from the Radar family, who were among the first settlers in Hawkins County around the time of the American Revolution. The quilt at the right came from her father's family, the Kings. Opal Rouse's Georgia Rattlesnake. My mother-in-law, Rachel Rouse, borrowed this pattern. They called it the Georgia Rattlesnake from Jane Brumett, who lived down here in Big Valley. Opal Steiner Rouse remembered. I helped my mother-in-law quilt it. We worked on it off and on from 1926 to 1929. We bought the material for 10 cents a yard, and we grew our own cotton, seeded it, and carded it to make the batten. It was a hard job picking out all them seed. They used to put a big batch of cotton round the fire every night and have everybody to seed enough to fill his shoes. So the bigger feet you had, the more cotton you had to seed. Little fellers didn't have as much to do, but it took a mighty long time to seed enough to fill even a little shoe, especially when they packed it in. Later on, we got a little homemade cotton gin, and that was a big help. Opal, who is now 81, was asked when she started quilting and how many quilts she had made during her lifetime. Oh gosh, I don't know how many quilts I've made. I couldn't begin to count. Hundreds of them, I guess. I started as soon as I was big enough to hold a needle. I guess I was 9 or 10 years old. We made them to use. Back then, when you didn't have no heat in the bedrooms, it took a lot of quilts to keep warm. We wore a lot of them out. Then I'd give a lot away. Opal still lives in a remote section of Union County, Tennessee, where her ancestors settled in pioneer times. The community is known as Lead Mine Bend because of the lead deposits in that area, some of which were extracted and hauled out in wagons and on flatboats by her family and others a century ago. She was asked if she enjoyed quilting. I sure do. I love it. I've quilted all my life, but I had to quit last year because my hands can't hold a small needle like you need to quilt. Judy Elwood with her grandmother's Lone Star quilt. Judy Elwood is shown here with the Lone Star quilt made by her grandmother, Ida Weaver Handy of Anderson County, Tennessee. This is one of 2 Lone Star quilts made by Mrs. Handy. According to Judy, the many other quilts she made throughout her life were utility quilts made from scrap material. Judy, who has a bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee in textiles and clothing, has now become hooked on quilts and quilting. She is a charter member of the Smoky Mountain Quilters Association and was largely responsible for organizing what has become the annual Smoky Mountain Quilt Show. She is co-author of the book, Tennessee Quilting. The Lone Star. from 5,024 pieces. If you have 5,024 tiny triangular shaped bits of cloth, a few months free time, and are skilled and dexterous of hand and mind, you can make yourself a quilt like the one shown here. If one were to remove the points of the star, he would have a great example of a spider's web. This Lone Star quilt was made in Hamblin County, Tennessee in the 1930s and is now owned by Lois Mahaffey of Powell, Tennessee. The variation of the Texas Lone Star pattern and of many other patterns seem endless. This one was made by Pearl Cleveland, who died at the age of 95 in the Graveston community of Knox County, Tennessee. Juanita Hutchison, granddaughter of Mrs. Cleveland, is pictured with the quilt. It belongs to Juanita's daughter, Lisa Hamilton, great-granddaughter of Pearl Cleveland. From Boston to Maine to Tennessee, the double T. When Charles and Margaret Sawyer were married in 1904, Margaret's Aunt Abby McPhail made this quilt for the Sawyers as a wedding present. Abby, who was an invalid living in Boston, was of Scottish descent and spent much of her time sewing and making quilts. Charles and Margaret Sawyer, who lived in Sabattus, Maine, gave the quilt to their son and daughter-in-law, Alan and Edith Sawyer, because of Edith's interest in quilts and quilting. Edith later gave the quilt to her daughter, Leanne Arnold, its present owner, who lived in Norris, Tennessee. Knoxville artist Ruby Dayton is shown with her adaptation of the popular log cabin pattern quilt, which she recently completed. The 1847 Sarah Carnes Blazing Sun quilt. According to family tradition, this quilt was made by Sarah Gammon Carnes in 1847 for her daughter, Mary, who was then 4 years of age. The Carnes were one of Knoxville's oldest and best-known families. They produced several notable citizens, including one mayor of the city. Frances Crippen-Hillman is the great-granddaughter of Mary Carnes and the great-great-granddaughter of Sarah, who made the quilt. She is the present owner. She acquired it in 1929. It is pieced, and the quilting designs in the all-white squares are similar to the pattern on the pieced squares. The pattern is a type of blazing sun. Aunt Lizzie Graves. A few hundred yards before we reached Lizzie Graves' house, we could see a long line of brightly colored quilts waving gently in the morning breeze. Her neighbor, Jeff Butcher, had told me of this 92-year-old quilter and that our visit couldn't have come at a more opportune time. At first, this energetic little lady was somewhat reticent, but when we asked about her quilts and her quilting, she became talkative. Everybody calls me Aunt Lizzie. Ain't nothing but Aunt Lizzie. My maiden name was Keck, and I was born in Claiborne County, Tennessee, close to the Union County line. They was 11 of us children, and I started making quilts when I was 12 years old. My mother, she kept her frames rolled up to the ceiling when she wasn't a-quilting. If she had up a quilt, 'cause the children would run against them and knock them first one way and then another, and it would mess them up. She kept them rolled up to the ceiling to where she could reach. I was always counted a fairly good quilter, but then still there's a lot of people that can quilt better than me. My mother-in-law was a whole lot better quilter than me. Her stitches, you couldn't tell them apart. They was all just exactly alike. Just before I got married, Mother helped me make 4 quilts. She raised sheep for the wool and then spun and wove it for the quilt backing. We called them Lindsay quilts. Yeah, I've sure enjoyed quilting in the wintertime. In the summer, I'm out working in the garden, getting in wood and such, but when cold weather comes, I like to quilt. This red quilt was always called the Four Hands, and it was made by my husband's mother, Sarah Jane Cook Graves, Lizzie remembered. I guess she was the best quilter I ever knowed. Sarah Jane Cook Graves, maker of the Four Hands quilt, is shown standing at the right. Her sister Lizzie is beside her, and her mother, Granny Honcook, is seated. The 2 men are Sarah Jane's brothers. Lucinda Angeline Pike Keck, Lizzie's mother, is shown here with husband Philip Keck and their 11 children. Lizzie is the small girl at left on the front row. She and the other 3 girls were referred to as the 4 little ones. The chip and whetstone quilt. Few articles were more commonplace in pioneer times and in rural America than the whetstone or wet rock. Used to sharpen all household and farm-related tools, it was usually elongated in shape, often tapering on either end, not unlike the points of the stars in this quilt. The whetstone was carried by the man of the house to sharpen his axe, for he was always chopping trees. Hundreds of times I have seen my grandfather sharpen his axe with his whet rock, then lay it beside a stump amidst piles of chips from the recently cut tree. I don't know whether or not this type whet rock and these type chips are connected with the derivation of the quilt's name, but that's what I think of when I hear the name, chips and whetstone. The 8 points of the star represent the whetstones, and the small pieces surrounding them are the chips, fresh-scented ash, oak, and hickory chips. This quilt, believed to have been made about 1885, is from the W.B. Ballard home located in the historic Fort Sanders section of Knoxville. Ballard, who was a conductor on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, died in the 1930s. Bachelor's Dream. David Byrd lives in the picturesque mountain town of Irwin, Tennessee, and has spent his life as a trader of Appalachian artifacts. When I asked him about quilts, he brought this one from his not-for-sale room, describing it as the best quilt he ever bought. He didn't have definitive background information on it, but stated that it came from the upper East Tennessee or western North Carolina area. The people from whom he bought it called it Bachelor's Dream. The Hannah Rebecca Blazier quilt. The name of the pieced and applique pattern of this quilt is not known to the writer, but its unusual, intricately quilted design includes wreaths, hearts, and crosses. It was made in the extreme eastern part of Tennessee in Sevier County near Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It is believed to have been made about 1878 and is signed by its maker, Hannah Rebecca Blazier. According to Al Dodson of Knoxville, owner of this interesting quilt, Hannah Rebecca Blazier came from Sevier County to the Kimberly Heights section of Knox County in a covered wagon in 1912. Al acquired the quilt from Dot Jones Plemons, granddaughter of Hannah Blazier, maker of the quilt. Photographed by Ed Meyer. Primrose and Rising Star. Bonnie Irwin Carden holds what she calls the Primrose and Rising Star pattern, which she made about 1925. It was pieced in the old house shown in the photograph where she lived at that time and was quilted at her parents' nearby home. Winnie Irwin's Oriental Poppy. This applique pattern was the work of a cousin, Winnie Irwin, and the quilting was done by her mother, Nora, sister Bonnie, and sister-in-law, Uretha Irwin. The pattern is believed to have been taken from a magazine in the early 1940s. Visiting old-time quilters. Some of my most memorable and rewarding experiences have occurred while visiting with a number of old-time quilters. They varied greatly in age, background, and economic status, but at the same time, they all had a great deal in common. Whether they were making quilts to sell, as presents, or for their own use, they all thoroughly and completely loved quilting. Flossie Cornett of Jeff, Kentucky said, "Oh Lord, I love it." Ethel Hall of nearby Viper said, "I'd druther quilt than to eat on the hungriest day ever I seen." All quilters emphasized the great joy and consolation which resulted from their quilting. Interestingly, most of those who expressed such enthusiasm tended to quilt alone. This is not to say they did not enjoy the social contact and the visitations, but it seems a person who enjoys quilting only with a group is not a true quilter. Much of the basic satisfaction of quilting comes from a successful effort to use imagination, ingenuity, and hard work to create something of one's own. The writer didn't talk with a single quilter who didn't seem happy and content, and so many of them were widows living alone. One may argue that only a contented, well-adjusted person would have the patience and perseverance to become a quilter in the first place, and that quilting itself did not contribute to their healthy state of mind. But quilting, like gardening, is great therapy. Psychiatrists might do well to study quilters with regard to the relationship between their art craft and their exuberance for life and living. If there is a universal trait shared by all, it may well be the pride and pleasure of creating. Even in completing such mundane tasks as weeding the flower bed, mowing the lawn, baking a cake, or cleaning a dirty oven, one has a sense of accomplishment and pride when one stands off and observes the completed job. How much more pride does one experience if the completed task is a work of great skill and art? The manner in which a quilt is made can reveal a good deal about the personality, temperament, philosophy, and general lifestyle of a person who made it. If one questions this premise, then he has but to examine and study the extraordinary workmanship and artistic attributes of some of the finer quilts made 100 years ago, now commanding prices ranging into the thousands of dollars. Then he should examine some of the many polyester quilts being made today, priced as low as $40 each. Bonnie Carden, active quilter at 86. Bonnie Irwin Carden is one of those people who looks the same today as she did 30 or 40 years ago. A recent visit found her exuberant because she had just finished, after several weeks of labor, her latest quilt, an endless chain. She is 86, but like most quilters, it seems to me, she appears many years younger in body, mind, and spirit. Bonnie, the daughter of Boss and Nora Irwin, was raised near the foot of Lone Mountain, a half-mile off the public road from the village of Andersonville. When her mother left her quilting frame unattended, Bonnie would grab the needle and thimble and start quilting. I would slip around the quilt when Mother was out, and I'd try and do as good a job as she did so she wouldn't know that I'd been quilting. I asked her how old she was when she started this. Well, I was a very small girl. I remember that I made my first dress when I was 9 years old, so I guess I was maybe 8 when I started slipping around and quilting. Much of Bonnie's quilting has been for the weekly quiltings at the Andersonville Methodist Church. The women charged a certain amount for quilting a quilt and donated the proceeds to the church. Once, Bonnie recalls, the group made a quilt themselves and sold it by means of a raffle for the benefit of the church. Then, Bonnie said, we began to get criticism from some other members that this was a form of gambling. That was the first and last time we ever raffled a quilt. When the church quilting ended in the late 1970s, Bonnie had been attending these weekly quilting bees for almost 60 years. While many people her age have difficulty finding enough to occupy their time, Bonnie has difficulty finding enough time to do the things she enjoys. It might be a little late in life to be so enthused about something like quilting, but I've just finished one and can hardly wait to get another one started. We'll stop right there for today. Such beautiful quilts in this part of the book, and beautiful thoughts too. I'll talk about those in a minute, but first I wanted to share this book with you. Someone sent me this. Thank you, whoever you are, if you're watching. Beautiful, beautiful book. The Quilts of Gee's Bend. Susan Goldman Rubin is the author of it. It has it's a beautiful story of the people in that area, but also just lovely quilts. Such beautiful quilts. And even at the end, I was trying to find, like, even there's lots of them, but there's just the lights shining right, an example. At the end, it even has a little, tells you how to make a quilt square. So really a beautiful book. If you are a quilter, you might want to check that out. And thank you very much to whoever sent it to me. It's got lovely stories and history in it of the women there, and it's just beautiful, a beautiful book. So please, if you're interested, you can check that out. Now, I love this last little part that I read in today's reading, where he talks about the joy of completing something. That's where I get my most satisfaction in life, is by completing something. I'm somebody that has a list, that likes to mark off things on the list. But more than that, and I've talked about this before, but like I worked at a college, I worked at the folk school, worked in those kind of educational settings, and I had a lot of responsibilities, and I got, I felt good when I completed them, and felt good that I did a good job in what I was overseeing and all that kind of stuff. But for me personally, what I feel the most fulfilled is when I'm doing stuff with my hands. Like he said, whether I'm washing dishes. Now I can't quilt, but when I used to paint, do folk art, and I'd finish something, if I'm doing something in the garden like he was talking about, I get it all planted or I get it all weeded. If I make a run of blackberry jelly and I picked them and I done it all. Same thing with putting up tomatoes. But even the daily things of, straightening up the house and doing up the dishes and cooking supper and all those kind of things give me real fulfillment, just to feel like I've accomplished something. So I really thought that was beautiful. Now, one of the previous readings we talked about the beauty of in necessity, like finding the beauty in the things you have to do, and that kind of goes right along with that, especially for me. Even washing dishes gives me gives me joy. Not to say that I'm always happy to wash a giant load of dishes, but just to have them all, I wash them and put them in the strainer. I don't always dry them and put them up right then, but just to have my kitchen all back in order makes me feel very accomplished, and it's just because I completed that task. So I really identified with that part. I love the part that we read through there where they're talking about seeding the cotton to actually, they grew the cotton. That had to be really satisfying. And then they harvested it, and then they had to seed it before they could use it for batting. And I love that picture of every night. That was just expected. Everybody in those days, of course, there was no, there wasn't a TV people was sitting around. So they were sitting around the fire to warm before they went to bed, I'm sure. And everybody, that was just their job while they sat there and talked and whatever. Maybe somebody read aloud or something, but they had to seed that cotton. And I've read that in other books too. How that they had to do enough to fit in their shoe, enough seeds, get enough seeds where they filled their shoe up, and then they were done. I wonder, like, whoever, it's just ingenuity there to come up with that, a parent, especially if it was the woman, like, you've all got to help, but you just have to help till you do this amount, you got to help. Of course, they were helping themselves too. They weren't just helping the mother quilt those beautiful quilts. They were helping to keep themselves warm once she quilted. You had to put batting in them. So I really loved that part, and even thought about, well, I might have been lucky because I have kind of small feet, so I wouldn't have had to do as much as someone that had a larger foot. And as far as those beautiful quilts in here, they're so hard to pick a favorite or anything like that. They're all so pretty, the ones I showed today. But I really liked Aunt Lizzie, that said that she was reticent at first when he first got there to talk, but then she opened up and started talking about how much she loved to quilt, and she was the one standing with the quilts on the clothesline behind her. I really enjoyed that part. And her and another lady, one of the others, I can't remember her name, but had said really her mother didn't have time to teach her to quilt, but then once she got married, her mother-in-law taught her to quilt. And Aunt Lizzie said her mother-in-law was the best quilter she ever knew. I really love that. I love the family, like that family sitting around the fire, but I love that connected family too, that once these ladies were married, they become so close to their mother-in-law that they had that in common with them. I really love that. I was blessed to have a great mother-in-law with Miss Cindy. Had a wonderful relationship with her always, and she was my biggest fan. I can't hardly say that without crying, but it was true. She was. No matter what I was doing, she was there to encourage me and to help me if she could, and give me advice if it was something. She could quilt. She could do those things. She didn't in the time that I knew her, but she could sew and do things and like I couldn't do. But anyway, I love that. In both those examples of the ladies talking about their mother-in-law in such praise, that's really heartwarming. And I wish all families could be like that. I know they're not, but I wish they could be. And then one of my favorite quilts, though, was the Blazing Sun quilt. It was 1847, and Sarah Carnes made it for her daughter. I don't know what it was about that. It just struck me as really beautiful, but somehow really simple too, and just the sweetness, I guess, of the daughter, her making it for her daughter, wanting to make it, maybe made me think of the ones that Granny's made for me. So I really loved that part. I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you, and maybe which pattern you liked the best. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday so we can see what John talks about next.